Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel. In this video, I'll be covering some of my best tips for new players when it comes to the post-apocalyptic world of Project Zomboid. Project Zomboid has incredible depth, so naturally, it can be quite difficult to pick everything up straight away. So with that in mind, I'm making this video to make things a little easier on you when you get started. Even if you've got a few hours of playtime, you might find something useful in this load of tips I'm about to unveil. If you do find this video useful, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. I'm also streaming Project Zomboid almost every day at the moment, so you can check out live gameplay on twitch.tv/Mr. Atomic Duck if you're interested. Lastly, it's worth me mentioning that these tips will refer to build 41, so some of this info may be slightly different if you're on build 40. Okay, with the usual shameless self-plugs out of the way, let's get started with those tips. First things first, there will be spoilers in this video, so if you want the true authentic experience the first time you play, leave now. Okay, tip number 1. This is probably the biggest tip I'd give anyone getting into Project Zomboid for the first time. Watch TV, specifically the channel Life and Living at 6 AM, 12 PM, and 6 PM. At 6 AM a cooking show is broadcast, and at 12 PM you'll be able to watch Woodcraft, which can level your carpentry, and the last show is at 6 PM is Exposure Survival, which teaches you a mixture of survival skills like trapping, farming, or foraging. If you can snag some books early on as well, you can boost the amount of experience you'll gain from watching these shows. So try to find a bookstore in the early stages of the game to maximize your chance of survival later on. After 9 days, the TV shows will stop broadcasting, so you want to try and watch as many of these as you can before that hits. So my next tip might seem like something that's a little bit more basic, but for a lot of new players, this is something that you might not be sure about just yet. Know the limits of your character when it comes to challenging zombies. For example, if you're just starting out and have a basic weapon like a rolling pin, you probably don't want to take on more than 2 or 3 Zeds at one time. Once you've got your hands on a better weapon and have had a chance to level up your stamina and strength, however, you might be able to take on 5 or 6. Linked in with this, using your environment can be a big help. When against large groups, don't be afraid to put windows or doors between you and the walking dead. And if you have a vehicle, you can always use that to lure them away from a site before looping around. If you're able to use doors or windows or something like that, it'll often stagger the zombies' approach and make things a bit more manageable for you, so you're dealing with 1 to 2 at a time inside of a big group. My next tip is when you're able to get out of the early stages of the game. Let's say you're starting to play regularly and surviving for a couple of weeks at a time. You want to put some stock into the long game. Teach yourself some farming, for example, and start growing crops as early as possible. It's a huge bonus to have these growing in the early stages because they can often take weeks to grow and will really help you out when the power goes out and fresh food is less available. Not to mention that it'll help you with leveling your cooking skill too and combining them with food recipes. Speaking of preparing for the long term, there are some key events that occur at specified time intervals. And again, I'd like to mention that if you want a spoiler-free experience, you may want to turn away now. Like we mentioned earlier, TV stations stop broadcasting after day 9, and water shuts off at any point, usually within the first couple of weeks, and electricity is usually within the first month, but this seems to be quite a random one. The sooner you can prep for these events, the better. Acquire a generator, stock up on fuel from a gas station, and try to get some rain collectors built using your carpentry. At around 8 days, you'll also want to be prepared for a helicopter event. This draws a heap of zombies to your current location, so the best thing I can recommend here is to be away from your base of operations at the time. If you're not careful, this results in your base being completely overrun, and even if you get out alive, it'll leave your base inaccessible. I like to try and take some longer trips around this kind of time period if you have a vehicle by that time, and that way you're always on the move and the hordes can't pin you down whilst the chopper is present. After it passes, you can head back home safely. My next tip is one that I think a lot of people underestimate in Project Zomboid, and that's picking up and moving items. Sure, the obvious ones like generators have their uses, but there are other items that you can collect for your base if your chosen location doesn't already have them. For example, water dispensers can often be found in office blocks and hold 250 units of clean drinking water. For all that water, they weigh just 5 kilograms and can be easily transported back to your base without the use of a vehicle. In situations where you don't have a well at your base, these can be a lifesaver, especially when you're unable to build rain collectors just yet. And even then, water dispensers can cut down the time it takes to purify the water by boiling it. So you can do the same with beds if your chosen base doesn't have one, and one of the items I like to transport are those big freezer units that you can find in gas stations to store more of my food for the long term. And this brings me nicely onto my next tip. Freeze as much of your fresh food as possible. Even in a refrigerator, your food is going to go rotten eventually. Throwing it into a freezer prolongs its lifespan significantly. Most freezers don't have a lot of space, so that's where those big gas station freezers units come in handy that I just mentioned. Just remember that your food will need some time to defrost, and with that in mind, I tend to take out a couple of items from the freezer and make up a batch of food at one time. This usually means I have 2 or 3 days worth of food and have a little time for things to defrost in between the next batch. Once your power goes out, cooking things in batches also saves on fuel if you're using a generator. Okay, this is a bit of a random one, but it was a lesson that I learned the hard way. If you do end up sleeping in a place that you don't think is very safe, be sure to check all of the closets and drawers. Sometimes they'll spawn alarm clocks that will already have alarms set on them. Do you see where this is going? Yeah, if that goes off during the night, you're going to wake up to a horde banging on the door. Don't make the same mistake that I did with this one. Okay, next up is vehicles. If you don't know this one already, driving into objects and running down zombies will result in damage to your vehicle. So, with that in mind, it's likely that your car won't stay in one piece forever, and will likely have some issues later down the road, even if you're careful with it. As you discover vehicles that you find keys for, I'd recommend making a note of where you found these vehicles. If your current vehicle starts to show signs of letting you down, you can always go and retrieve one of these ones that you found keys for earlier to serve as a stand-in or a replacement altogether. If you're having trouble navigating the map in Project Zomboid, there's a handy website that you can consider using the URL map.projectzomboid.com. This map essentially shows you locations that are points of interest or lootable, and this can be a big help when you're not too familiar with the game or its locations. You'll be able to quickly identify where you want to head to, and honestly, I don't think the in-game maps are all that great, so I use this myself during most of my playthroughs just as a personal choice. Lastly, I wanted to take a quick look at some of the key items that I recommend having in your inventory at all times when you're getting started. Firstly, try and find some clean clothes within your first few minutes of a playthrough and rip them into rags. You can use these as a bandage if you get injured, and you'll want to make sure that you do so quickly to avoid the undead being able to track your scent. Secondly, a can opener can be incredibly useful to have on your person at all times. You might find that you're caught without food, and once the power goes off, you're not going to be able to find anything except canned goods. If you're in a bad spot, this will help you source food quickly. Any medical supplies you pick up along the way are worth keeping on your person too, at the very least some painkillers and beta blockers. I like to keep some antibiotics too myself, and lastly, a water bottle is essential. This will keep you topped up on water automatically until the bottle is empty, so all you need to do is top up once in a while and you'll be all good. There are some other helpful items like screwdrivers if you want to learn some electrical skills, or carrying around an axe to be able to break down some doors, but these aren't necessarily essential like the other items I've mentioned. That's it from me in this one, folks, but if you find this guide useful, remember it's a big help to me if you drop a like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.